There's been a lot of attention in the secret court concerning the Revenge X's, or the Portland Girl office, which is generated for the insurrectionists of the Caliphate of the Confederacy engaging in the insurrection by the use of the surveillance terrorism in order to engage in lawfare or war against the United States citizens guilty of nothing in the jurisdiction for the overthrowing of the Republic and the ignoring of the Constitution in favor of their arbitrary abuses. At which point the subcontract of those who had to have originally bought off the attention or approval by the prostitution or other means surrounding the subject concerning their political influence by becoming sexual partners. And the rest of it would have actively had to have engaged in these positions in order to have acquired their objectives, at which point the payment of these structures actively creates a contradiction, because in order to get the approval of David, they would have had to have been with him instead of the black market's uh, Confederate rape permit structure. Uh, the those who would have purchased access to their sexuality, compelling their participation, wouldn't receive it, and thus they would generate the natural jealousy of forfeiting it to the free market, at which point the activity of their submission to the Confederacy is their permission to not have control of their body, is their objective to leverage it for their political influence, at which point those who have, such as J-Secular Civil War, who have been bought off by as politicians by the prostitutes, such as the Ukrainian prostitutes, when they were uh, negotiating the overthrow of the government in Oregon by the non-government white nationalists who have replaced the American Republic, which was originally projected to be subject to David and as the patriarchy, which generates the position of the switches of who got elected instead of the Americans, the voter fraud for the Confederacy, means they picked the ones that they were going to give the prostitutes in order to get them to buy off, maximizing the potential likelihood of the successful insurrection, normalizing the coup. At which point you have the revenge axis, who actively, having received the original estimate for the advantage of their subjugation to the Confederacy um, as a miter, have accepted the full due diligence of supporting and promoting pedophilia, as that is, as a minor, they are being celebrated as an adult, and thus they wanting to be treated like they're mature and pretty, or actively participating in the collaboration of the approval for this mechanism generating their place in the original position, at which point their arrangement to have dated David as a minor from the very beginning would have actively had their negotiations of bartering and competition um, in the auction war of actively competing with everyone else in the market for all of the various reasons. Now, they, having not received the contract according to the projection from the military intelligence, uh, would not receive the advantage of David and would have to have left back to the Confederacy, which is no longer accepting them in their abusive position. Their An example of this is one of their attractive, popular girls uh, wasn't able to negotiate, liked David, but didn't want to negotiate in his favor because she would be forfeiting her place in her group, who would reject her for supporting the patriarchy. At which point, her originally having dated David means that she would have supported the patriarchy, which means her group rejecting her in that example would have rejected her for having dated David for the interracial relationship, which is condemned amongst the Confederacy, and not being able to conduct the pretend uh, progressivism of supporting the interracial relationships with the black communities, there is no strategy to the thing because they lost the contract, and thus there is no strategic advantage into pretending the support of the interracial relationship as far as that is concerned, generating a series of contempt on the basis of not being able to be with David and not being able to be with Confederacy, having no actual place in society. So you have the act of seeking the retaliations, which actively compounds on itself by having access to the murder hobo terrorists from the White Nationalists, from the Confederate overthrow of the American government, and access to the surveillance terrorists for the KKK contracts facilitates their ability to satisfy their revenge. At which point, the rape permits actively puts them with the Confederate guy, and the Confederate guy being jealous of David, not just as a competitor in who wins the war, but as a sexual competitor, as the girl that he's raping is actively supposed to be with somebody else, which means that he feels vulnerable that he could lose her to him in a free contest, and if the Americans win the Civil War, then by definition the law will pull her away and satisfy the original human decency. So he feels vulnerability at both sides, at which point an A plus B equals C, whereas A is the guy and B is the girl, and C is the outcome of the restoration of the human decency. Now, C can mean the Joe Lee position of distributing the sexual opportunities to David so that he doesn't pay attention to her because he pays attention to the distraction. Or it can mean the loving, affectionate, focused, eccentric sex of the angelic type of sex arranged in a positive relationship, which would have actively engaged in the normal sexual market exchanges, uh, in the promotion and celebration of her femininity and superiority in these arrangements. Or you have the contradiction to this, which is the dominatrix. And the dominatrix is the punishments for having engaged in the subject. Now, if David doesn't have a distraction, he has to pay attention to her. And if he has to retaliate against her bad behavior, then he has to punish her in the dominatrix, switching the dominatrix and subservient roles in this engagement. Now, while the Confederates are in control, she has the dominatrix power, and he's forced to be their submissive as she uses the abuse for the porn, and her rapists and the rest of their groups use it for the porn. And thus, the switch of the intent from A is to create the dominatrix inverted if they lose. So the fighting retreat, uh, A plus B equals dominatrix. And if he loses, then by definition, they want to forfeit in the position because the rapists hate women. And the men who hate women, using the female Gnosticists, are actively trying to extort them into the negative positions where they're forced to be punished or suffer more for not being subject to them, at which point they then, avoiding the threat of injury, are then drawn to the rapist because the alternative is abuse. And so that's what they want. And she wants, all of the girls who are fulfilling this position of X's is a lot because there would have been a lot of girls actively competing for his attention. The most attractive girls from around the world would have actively been sent in order to have negotiated the political treaties' influence on all of the various positions. So there are hundreds of girls involved, and the Confederates are the only ones who would have been doing the abuse. So there are lots there by definition, and so the Confederates would have had to have cheated and promoted the most amount of attractive girls that they could possibly muster, and thus those Confederate girls are all revenge X's, and those revenge X's are actively seeking the retaliation, and thus are actively working, currently enjoying the advantages of dominatrix, and if they lose, then they are subject to the dominatrix, and if it's what they're looking for, then by definition there's nothing to change, because even if they lose, they get what they want. Clever girl. But if that's not what they want, if they want him to pay attention to them in the positive way, then by definition he can't be subject to the dominatrix. So then you have the positive affirmation of the femininity, which is actively against the interest of the rapists, who want them to be aged out and unattractive and lose and then become desperate hollow husks, similar to the banshees of old, which were basically just young, attractive women who used to learn how to sing for the nobility, paid with unsustainable wages, such as alcohol. And then once they get too old, they're unattractive and they're forced to go into the forest and then wail for all of the misery that they don't have any good living conditions, and they have to sing and cry until they die of the elements. At which point you actively have these competing interests fighting over the specific outcome. And how they behave according to the system tells the record what they're actually looking for as the fighting retreat objective. If they want to be the center of attention, or if they don't want to be the center of attention, if they want it to be celebrated, if they want it to be abused, if they want to be punished, if they want to feel any certain way, they're going to create the alchemy of the algorithm for the algebra to have behaved the appropriate way beforehand to have earned the outcome. So they would have sent the wizards in the secret courts and others in order to have made sure that their particular interest in the black market is satisfied, and thus those who are competing over their identity are also doing the same thing in generating the compulsion from the insurrectionist position of having cornered David and the others to be harassed under the specifically manipulated artificial simulated conditions, so that the side effects would be produced accordingly, and thus their interest would actively be fighted over under the black market's criminal exchanges, similar to a normal stock market except for crime. So if they're trying to corner the market, then they're actively making sure that they're the only ones who the targets are allowed to pay attention to in the positive or for the negative. But for the girl that they want to refer to as the original placeholder for the Tifa character, there was an agreement from the record that David was supposed to protect her as soldier at least one time, but it's actually a trick. So, like when you go through a video game and you have a tutorial, some tutorial games actively give you an additional unit, like an additional security guard, an additional support unit. And that additional agent facilitates your superior diversity by numbers. So the multiple agents available for the objective allows you to accelerate through the game with the better units. At which point it looks like she's basically pulling that trick off. So by definition, not finishing the tutorial and going into the game forces the security to go with her. At which point she's enjoying the multitude advantage of having purchased the security for the one time, at least in the tutorial, or a little bit into the game, into the activity of the entirety of the game, at which point the extortion signifies the position that it is one of the two, as the position has to be that she's exclusively focused on for an extended period of time. Then by definition, if the Americans win, then she defaults into the attention for the positive or for the dominatrix as a mechanism of the strategy, to give the example. So they set up many schemes, including defamation rackets, where the target being defamed is exponentially suppressed in status and human decency and can be dragged for, you know, a misrepresentation of reality, as they order up a trick similar to the reality TVs where they set up little nonsense things like Ashton Kutcher's old show, where the point is to find a mark and then set up an embarrassing situation that they're not in on, that the audience is in on, and then everyone can laugh at them. But then you take that and you artificially don't change the information by releasing the discovery of what the con was, and then you keep the part where you have the distraction that everyone's supposed to laugh at, which generates the capacity to set up the murder hobos for their illegitimate retaliations off of the trip, which is the reinforcement of the position of the dominatrix outcome in the algebra. So in the part where they're in on it, they've co-signed the automation of the outcome because it's what they're looking for. So by definition, if they don't want that, they have to go through the process of the terms and services of surrendering at the market price and returning to the state of neutrality, which requires their active participation as they've automated through the signing of being collaborators with the offense. It requires them to be proactive about the solution and the correction back into the actual intent, which requires them to engage with the target in person, publicly acknowledged with the thing for the disillusionment of the thing, which includes the full acknowledgement of the offense and its full due diligences as to have made the public dismantlement of what the trick was, so that the public does not continue the side effects of the automation in the contract. So the act of gaslighting, or the use of gross negligence as a plausible deniability mechanism, means that they're going to pretend to not be involved in it, like if they are an actual mark for the subject, which generates the natural reproductions compounding the legal difficulties of each of the various problems in the insurrectionist war, where they've compounded these criminal simulations in order to generate the extorted value. So they have actively set up a fighting retreat where they know what the punishment is if they conduct specific violations. So if they win, nothing happens except for they divide the spoils of war, and if they lose in the specific defaulted way. Because despite whatever they say about not having access to the American policies, as Confederates, they are blocking the American policies in order to acquire the Confederate policies, which means they were in fact informed about the legal procedures of the American answers, and thus they were aware of the law, and thus they're culpable. Now, for those who feel like they're in danger from these types of situations, do understand you are absolutely right. You're just wrong about how you're in danger. The threat is the wizards creating the simulation. Their control over the situation facilitates all of their actions against the person you're being distracted with. So when you're doing a magic trick, you actively distract them with a fraudulent thing to look at, which is the mark, and then you have the actual realization of the entire threat, which is generated by what the material resulting trick is. And then in a benign way, then it becomes entertainment. But in this version, it is catastrophic white nationalist KKK threats, which is an infinitely diverse threat, including the threat of being poisoned by military grade viruses specifically designed to maximize long-term life-crushing, economic collapsing problems, such as the position of highly contagious diseases, such as the poisoning of people with syphilis when they poisoned the black community in order to have engaged in their false experiments that don't actually have any scientific merit or productivity, which also at the same time requires them to remove the possibility of medicine with a placebo, which generates the compounding terrorist threat. So you are actually under an infinitely more severe threat than you could have possibly imagined when simply looking at the target. So, for instance, if they were actually the type of girl who wanted the dominatrix position, they would have actively used their surveillance powers to engage in the abuse, and it would be basically just torture porn. So they're probably having sex while they're abusing their targets, at which point it becomes, for that type of person who are into those types of kinks, an active accelerant. So the more severe the trauma inflicted on people, the more sexual gratification there is, which actively makes the target a POW or a trafficked person or a sexual submissive in the dominatrix relationship. So if the Americans win, their algebra requires the flipping of the subjects if they would have been in the relationship, similar to uh, in their estimate of David's character, who they would have had to have dated originally, at which point they want him to not be able to think about anyone else, so he has to consider them, but they want the dominatrix relationship, so the fighting retreat is just switching who's the dominatrix and who's the submissive. So, an example of having satisfied that would have been like with the Portland Girl office, where I believe the men who hate women from the White Nationalists trying to get the female Gnosticists to expire women's political identities, political currency, uh, wanted to set her up in collaboration to be a key trade function in the creation of Ukraine as a proxy war in order to quote unquote kill the most Russians possible, which requires them to actively avoid any peace negotiations, especially any peace negotiations back into the original order, where David would have had his treaty, which would have stopped any potential problem uh, with the least amount of cost as the highest in grade of investment into their mutual security from that original order would have already been satisfied, and thus it would have been exponentially more smooth and inexpensive without these disturbances. So the Ukrainians that they thought would have won the specific things are actively being retaliated against and forced to suffer because that girl lost the contract, and thus this is their retaliation. This is basically just a crazy hot girl uh, who lost what she was looking for, actively destroying everyone else's life who she feels or somebody else felt would have taken it from her, facilitating her revenge by the use of these conflicts to relieve her emotional state, which would be normal to dominatrix. So, the threat is actually catastrophic and infinitely diverse and unable to be able to be dismantled by definition. So, if the target's uh, X is actively engaging with people in the general public who are being coerced against them, we'll call them Y, then by definition, the coercion by Z, the person getting revenge for the subversion, would actively be trying to separate them by as many distractions and violence and threats and problems as possible in order to artificially generate the simulated spell where they've accomplished their mission in the isolation and intimidation and social engineering, such as the retaliation of the threat that he would be thinking about someone except for her, and thus you have the type of situation similar to Hercules, the animated series, where you have Athena uh, getting summoned by Hercules in order to get a date to some prom. And then he crafts a clay version of a girl, and then Athena pretties it up, and he just says, I just want her to be hot and crazy about me. And then she gives the clay life, and it's hot and it's crazy about her. And well, you should watch the episode if you can find it. But shenanigans ensue. But yeah, Aphrodite knew exactly what was going to be happening, but it's It's a pretty good episode if you could find it. I haven't been able to find it though. But in any records indicate that the belief of the Confederacy of manipulating their criminal engagements in order to engage in the position of crafting how the punishments would look are both for incentives and for disincentives, such as the cross and bones who actively engage in the use of compromising positions in order to make sure that everyone is mutually kept in place. So by definition, like they're too scared to rat on the other one, so they actively are not going to betray their group, because if they betray their group, then the group will betray them, and thus they'll get punished for the crimes that they intended to do in order to enter the group. So, with that in mind, if the Confederates, from the racist infinite terrorism excuse of the KKK Confederate militia engagement of double agents inside the government, especially the sheriffs who are seeking the national sheriff's position, such as their intent to have used the no longer useful FBI, um, who've attempted too many Nazi coups, but since the Confederacy is a self-sustained nation, by definition, they don't need any of the shells that they're corrupting. So the FBI failing doesn't really change any of the power dynamics, so long as they get to infect the next thing. At which point, the assumption that is, if the Americans win the Civil War, then the active punishments from the American policies will include the assumption of the Constitution being upgraded. So they're going to remove the $10,000 fine for treason, and they're going to have it be a punishment of sentencing them to the Confederate state from David's influence as the patriarchy. And their assumption is that this would be in that they would have made it in Texas. Um, they believe that uh, when David's restored into his title as intelligence oversight, controlling the military police at the highest levels to engage in the threat against these insurrectionists, that he was going to have them punished under the normal policies of the Americans and then sentence them to the Confederacy to suffer their own Confederate policies. Uh, to those who murdered Don Sr. or were actively essential to it, they believe that David wanted to specifically corner them in the punishment so that he can skin them alive himself and then throw them in the ocean and tell them to survive or die, at which point they would have to swim to shore after being skinned and turned into a trans. So, perks to them. This is the first time they get to be an attractive female. Um, then they can swim to the various checkpoints where they'll be fed and given enough water until they are corralled into the Confederate state at its predetermined location. Um, and they do so or they don't do so, and then would continue on to the normal policies of their specific customs as to not genocide the creeps. But whatever they believe the punishments are is really disconnected from anything except for their acknowledgement of the intelligence oversight function from the military intelligence on the issue of what American policies their obstruction is targeting in favor of the system of promoting the Confederacy. So they do voter fraud against the American policies and officers, and they promote their Confederate policies and officers. So they actively have access to redacted information, which their assessment is based upon these redactions, which acknowledges the satanic child sacrifice system of the creation of the Antichrist system, which would be, again, like murdering Don Sr., a highly punishable offense, as it requires them to attack essential functions in history in favor of maximizing the most amount of evil with the least amount of investment through a series of the expansive thought of Confederate magic through dark psychology, which is the smallest amount of good for the most amount of evil, as they actively not cooperating with the American rule of law, actively conduct the sedition in the reinforcing of these positions in favor of the protection of the Confederate insurrection, or their infinite racist abuses, such as their targeted communities to be subject to the wizard communism, as they are socially engineered into being self-defeating until they are subject to the natural state crafted for them by their enemies, as the various political identities, including women, are subject to these positions. The extortion of the female Gnostics, having expired the entirety of their accounts, would then subjugate themselves permanently to these abuses, which they would have corrected the solution for. So originally, the American women had gained political influence through X, Y, and Z, which is specifically countered after the trap is set, permanently subjugating them and their children forever and ever until they cease to exist as a posterity. Regardless of what they want to say when they're lying to you in their magic, they are in fact not feminists, as they do not promote the existence of the free exercise of women or voter rights, which are essential to women voting and having influence, which is being exacerbated by the over-indebted position of removing all of their political currency, as they are subjugated into the mock relocations of being the subservient slaves as chattel, only slightly better than the niggers, who they treat with absolute contempt and disdain, as they are artificially forced to act inferior, with inferior speech and inferior education. So too the women are to be seen and not to be heard. Now, many of these targeted communities, such as the black community, were treated with absolute horrific disdain, such as the promotion of eugenics, such as the facilitation of abortion as a specific way of curtailing and limiting the abused targets. So they artificially are created a sustained lower state so that it is too expensive in order to have kids, so that they automate the process for the white nationalists to have reduced their population without looking like the monster that they are. At which point, the active promotion of transsexuals is the removal of the ability to reproduce, which makes them a targeted community by the white nationalists, who hate them and have historically abused and created them from scratch, generating the disposition of the absolute horrific function of the targeted communities by the military-industrial educational complex, specifically conducting and leveraging the false experiments in order to conduct their satanic cult sacrifices. So these infinite rackets are generated so that you blame the target and abuse the target, similar to the trans community, who, having been a victim of the targeting, would then have other phantom self groups of the white nationalists who exponentially threaten and abuse them for having been targeted and being abused. They then are subject to infinitely more automated abuse, which is payment for having turned them into a transsexual by the military industrial educational complex, who are the KKK wizards who generated the issue, at which point the abuse is payment for having conducted the change, at which point you exponentially reproduce and populate the targeted community of whatever various effect that you pretend you're going after, at which point the phantom cells of abusing them is the recreation of their population by the artificial mechanism from the wizard. And so the function of engaging in the non-Druid Christian function of redemption actively requires them to have not abused them. So no Christian who is actively being blamed in an attachment with the Druid recreation of the Christian nationalists, which are not Christians or nor are they nationalists, they're just Confederate insurrectionists who are engaging in the delusion by disguising and infiltrating the various churches by which to deceive the general public into thinking that their victims who they've compromised are in fact the bad guy, when in fact they are the solution, which is not new. The KKK has actively had pastors from various denominations become actively involved in the terrorist operations for the white nationalism, in their complete rejection of the source material, as they are the condemned enemy who practice everything that God hates from the Bible in service of their druid position, which is an infiltration or infection for this Satanist position. The cult functions of the KKK and other secret societies often start as a drinking society, which actively evolves into its ritual functions, maturing into their service and subjugation under the addiction of the devil worship, which, as is common to all addictions, is it feels like you are the exception to the addiction until you're not, and then you are its slave permanently and must do as your master bids, which has actively turned many cocaine addicts into thieves who have actively destroyed their families' lives, who naturally have to reject them and throw them out in order to sustain their livelihood while actively bothered by the existence of the thieving fools who are actively destabilizing the potential of their maintenance of the pursuit of happiness by the artificial compulsion into satisfying the addiction that they are property of. And as you become more and more self-aware of the nature of your slavery to the addiction of the Confederacy, you have to choose to repent while you have the possibility. Otherwise, you are permanently going to be subject to it, and it will be inescapable except by death. Unless Christianity is correct, and then death will not save you from the addiction, which has specifically been paying for this specific eternity under their control. At which point the devil worshippers will have their devils and suffer the function. At which point the engagement requires you to surrender at market price and engage in the full due diligences and cooperation with the American government against the Confederate insurrectionists who are actively conducting sedition and blocking the legal functions of government for the remedies to the Confederate insurrectionist terrorist operations, otherwise known as magic or a remedy to a secret, generating the position of the loyalty to the United States constitutional republic against the insurrectionists who are, by definition, um, anarcho terrorists similar to the ones that they reproduced in the Middle East, except for exponentially worse because by definition they would have kept a few of their secrets and their goat fucking aside would actively conduct some of these operations as they themselves would have kept the superior technology and techniques private for the further continuation of those operations other than just their recruits abroad. With full discovery in motion, or at least actively traded in the public affair for the paper trading of the original market as they make their larger settlements and become more refined into the actual functioning American free market, then we can begin to enjoy capitalism as opposed to the wizard communism we have endured for so long under our artificially created failures, which have specifically been forcing us to uh, limit ourselves from all of our successes actively being redirected into the artificial criminal collapses of the controlled, centrally planned economy for the white nationalist interest, having chosen winners and losers as the assertion of the choosing of status artificially on the basis of the white nationalist KKK secret councils, generating the wizard courts, which facilitate the manifestation of an abusive magic structure, commonly understood as a kangaroo court. Infiltrations such as in January 6th, where the protest, which is falsely labeled an insurrection, was actively promoted by double agents inside the structure as it was crafted as a manipulation acceleration of their War on David terrorist attack under the assertion that California would have lost to the Americans after it was overthrown by the Confederacy and used as a husk in order to fight the Americans in order to overthrow the legal governments. At which point, the assumption is that the Americans winning reestablishes David's title, which reasserts him as the authority in the aristocracy over California, which would have generated the release of the prisoners who were convicted by the Confederates and thus had no authority to be restrained by the Americans who were not conducting due process against them, as their restraints are exclusively connected to Confederate functions. Thus, there was no legal American procedure compelling their release, which would have generated lots of prisoners, which would have actively uh, was suggested that they would have actively demonstrated in DC. So they're doing a replacement false flag crafted from that theory. So, as an example, that would have to actively be admitted for the legal market to be asserted, as their crimes is criminal intention, and criminal intention is on their foundation of the perception of reality before strategy, which facilitates necessary components in order to materialize a legal projection or theory about what was obstructed by their wizard warrants, which asserts the person's search and the things to be seized and the things to be altered in favor of their war in order to acquire their strategic objectives in the overthrow and dismantlement of the rule of law in favor of chaotic terror. These and many other essential functions would actively be essential to the election of an American president, who, by definition, in order to honor the oath of having been sworn in, correctly had to have declassified the information and outed the Confederate insurrectionist threat, which actively has asserted policies to protect Confederate policy against American law, at which point you actively have the internal insurrectionist function. So if you are loyal to the Confederacy, you cannot be American elected, and by definition, their functions have actively been conducting voter fraud, especially the blocking of essential politicians from being elected who are going to be representatives of the United States according to the original legal functions before obstruction. At which point, if they're going to be elected legally as president or others, but especially the president, they do have to order the declassification or promise of declassification of the Confederate offenses, which have been recorded as the insurrectionist function of the uses of government, compelling the obligation of them to have put them in the appropriate place to be released, as their classification is specifically designed for the blocking of discovery for the purpose of sedition, such as the arresting of those essential to arresting them, protecting their position as insurrectionists until there ceases to be an American system, at which point the parasite would have eaten out the core of the host and left it nothing but a purposeless husk.